Hello and welcome to our another episode of Informally Formal. I'm truly excited today because we have a very important topic, trade and trade policy. And to talk about it, we have with us Dr. Zaidi Sattar. And I can go on forever to introduce him, but we need to get into the meat of our conversation. So very briefly, Dr. Zaidi Sattar is the chairman and CEO of Policy Research Institute Bangladesh since its inception in 2009. He holds a PhD degree in economics from the United States, has taught there for many years, has been in senior positions with World Bank. More importantly though, he has been an integral part of the formulation of the 6th five-year plan of Bangladesh as well as the 7th five-year plan. But I must also add that a lot of people may not know that Dr. Zaidi Sattar was also a civil servant. He is CSP batch 1969 before he left for his higher education, his doctoral degree in the United States. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Zaidi Sattar.
Thank you for introducing your very complimentary introduction. And as you well know, I'm a civil servant, former civil servant turned trade economist. So that gives a very different flavor to what perhaps I'm going to talk about and how I'm going to approach this whole subject.
Let me dive right into my first question. First and foremost, I guess, for our viewers, I would like for you to paint a picture as to why trade and trade policy in general is important for the world. And then, of course, I would like to hear your views on why it is equally important, of course, for Bangladesh. So over to you, Dr. Sattar.
Thank you for this very comprehensive question, and the answer also probably needs to be as comprehensive, but I will try to be very brief. The critical importance of trade for global economic progress began to be felt just before the Second World War. You know, the Great Depression happened starting in the United States with the collapse of the stock market, and then it spread, throughout the world. The leading economists of the world and the leading politicians, leaders of the world, after the Second World War, realized that you cannot have, the kind of policies that preceded the Second World War. That is, policies that were during the time of the Great Depression, when country after country was imposing tariffs and restrictions on their imports to try and protect their own economies. That simply led to the collapse of international trade and also simultaneously led to the collapse of economies around the world. And they realized this is not the way the world works. So post-war, the leading economists of the world, the leading politicians of the world, they got together and said, we need to have a new world economic order. And that world economic order included open trade as much as possible, opening up trade, opening up access to global markets. And that is the economic order that we have experienced for 70 years after the Second World War. And that gave the world economy tremendous boost in incomes. And of course, trade grew even faster than the growth in income, telling us that it was trade that drove the prosperity. It was trade, international trade, that drove prosperity around the world. And that fact, that trade really opens up economies and boosts economic activities globally, is also valid within a national economy like Bangladesh, particularly for a developing economy. And this, again, was realized after the Second World War, when a lot of colonies, previously these were colonies, which were becoming independent, and they wanted to grow fast. They wanted to become developed countries, or at least bridge the gap between the developed and developing. And trade became one of those medium through which they could attain economic prosperity. So developing countries also realized the criticality of trade in their economic activities. And if trade is important, both for the global economy and for national economies, then what determines the quantum of trade, which means the exchange of goods and services across borders, that is determined by trade policies.
Thank you, Dr. Sattar. That was a very interesting overview of how our current trade practices have come into place since Second World War. That was really very, very interesting. Let me now ask you in particular about the evolution of trade policy and trade practices in Bangladesh. Over to you, Dr. Sattar.
Yeah, that's a very relevant question and very practical one for Bangladesh. And it would be interesting to see how it evolved. First of all, when Bangladesh became independent in 1971, we actually inherited whatever baggage that was left from the Pakistan times. For 2 decades, until the end of 1980s, we followed that kind of very high protected import substituting regime that produced neither industrialization, nor created jobs, nor generated growth. But in the 1990s, we changed direction. Of course, there had to be a crisis, a political come economic crisis that happened in 1990, created, I would say, the opportunity for making changes, because by that time, leaders, policymakers realized that Bangladesh economy wasn't really was becoming dynamic enough. And there were other countries in the world, like East Asia. East Asian countries already showed that they could grow 7-8% for a couple of decades and completely transform their economy. So they were following certain trade policies, which is now known as export-led growth, something that we completely missed out for 2 decades. So in the 1990s, we changed direction, moving from a highly import substituting closed economy policy to an export-oriented, export-led growth policy. And trade policy, in addition to trade policy, there were also macroeconomic policies and other supporting policies. But trade policy was very critical in making that transformation. We rationalized tariffs. We liberalized trade. So from restricted trade to liberalized trade, that is what we did in the 1990s. There was exchange rate flexibility introduced. There was current account convertibility introduced, though very limited way. Tariffs were rationalized. Imports were liberalized. We attained average of 5% growth in the 1990s. We went up to 6% in the next 10 years. It went up to 7% in the next 10 years, and so on. And in my view, trade policy change played a critical role in turning an economy that was only growing at 3.5% to an economy that started accelerating.
The crisis that we find ourselves in right now, where in the entire world we see not only from a demand side, but also from a supply side, the entire trade has shrunk. Do you believe this gives us an opportunity to do something different or bold as far as trade and trade policy of Bangladesh goes? And also, at the same time, if you'd also reflect on the 5th trade policy review, WTO's trade policy review from last year, and I'm sure you have also seen our Commerce Minister's response to those. So if you'd briefly reflect on those, but go to my first question.
Okay, very.
All right, over to you.
To start with, yeah, that's a very, very good point you made. When we entered, when we joined, we were the original, members of the WTO. Because we were members of GATT, so we automatically we didn't have to go through accession like Vietnam did or China did.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So yes, so we were already doing some reforms during the early 1990s, and if there was a World Bank study that came out in 2004, which looked at many developing countries around the world, and they listed about 10 developing countries which they called globalizers, and Bangladesh was included among those globalizers. If you look at the record, Bangladesh as a least developed country um, was one of the biggest beneficiaries of the special and differential treatment that the World Trade Organization provided to least developed countries. And unlike any other LDC, Bangladesh has done very well in its export performance, and particularly manufacturing export performance. What has happened in the past, let's say 25 years after the initial, the robust steps that we took in opening up, we went a bit slow. We slowed down a bit, and something started happening, which is particularly in the tariff schedules, in the tariff structure. What started happening was there was a lot of resistance because we opened up. There was some suggestion that we opened up too much, too fast. Since you make that point about the crisis as being an opportunity, there's a Nobel laureate economist who said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So basically what that tells Bangladesh is, look, here is a crisis. You want to come out of it, and we have to come out of it. And to come out of it, first of all, we've got to put this virus under control. We have to put our arms around it and really suppress whatever damage this virus has been doing on the health side. Once that is done, then we can talk about getting out of this slump. And that is going to be a huge challenge. Business as usual policies are not going to be the answer this time. So, you see, because the trade shock, as you can see already, ready-made garment export declined 17%. Non-ready-made garment exports didn't decline 17%. It declined only 3%. Now note, there's a reason for that. And the reason is we are big when it comes to ready-made garments in the world market. We are 6.5% of the world export market. But when it comes to the non-ready-made garment exports, which we have plenty, people think that what are we going to export? But there are as many as 1,300 six-digit items that we exported in the fiscal year 2019.
Wow.
Plenty of items. And 290 of them were only 290 of them were above $1 million. So the rest, were 1,100 items were less than 1 million. So they're so small. And what we look at when we look at the record, what we see is we've got, every year there are new products entering the export market. It's called discovery, but they don't last. They don't sustain. Barely 25, 1 in 4 items of exports that come up in the export basket, they sustain for, let's say, up to 2020. So we've got a problem of not being able to sustain exports. And I describe that as a trade policy problem. We have a fundamental trade policy problem domestically. We can think of, markets, export markets out there in the world. For those non-ready-made, non-garment exports, the market's share is very small, infinitesimal. We are just 1%, less than 1%, 0.005% in each of these products. What we have is a situation where selling in the domestic market is much more profitable than selling in the export market. If you produce shoes that you would export for, let's say, 500 taka, that will fetch you 500 taka, you get 1,000 taka in the domestic market because you have 100% duty on shoes. It is the protection duty on shoes, on plastics, on agro-processing products, on even electronic goods and so on and so forth. They are so heavily protected that you end up making huge profits domestically. There are so many restrictions. When you try to export, you're not going to get that price. So why would you export? And that is the crux of the export diversification challenge. People talk about export diversification as if it's going to happen. We're doing so much. We are giving cash subsidy, 5% to 20% cash subsidy to so many different products. They are trust sectors and so on and so forth. But there is a simple fact. To the entrepreneur who's going to produce and invest, he will look at the two markets. There's not a third market. You export or you sell in the domestic market. And I see for non-garments, the choice is very clear.
Looking at the broad picture, we all know our export basket needs diversification.
Yes, absolutely.
We have there's just too much concentration of ready-made garments, of almost 84, 85%.
Yes.
It's a very vulnerable situation, as you can well imagine. What are some of your suggestions that you would want to put out there as to very quickly point, what we could do to help us out of this situation?
Okay, let me tell you something. Anything that we produce domestically, particularly in the manufacturing sector, and we are producing 95% consumer goods. We are producing very few intermediate goods. For anything that we produce domestically, we have set tariffs, protective tariffs, at a very high level. Not only do we have custom duties, okay, which is the top rate of 25% is imposed on all the consumer goods that we produce. But on top of that, there are supplementary duties, there are regulatory duties, and so on. So we've got high tariff protection for everything that we produce domestically, and these are protective duties. But at the same time, the input tariffs, the inputs that they use, input tariffs are very low, under 10%. There's a huge gap between tariffs on input and the tariffs on output. As a result, what happens is, if you have heard of the expression called effective rate of protection,
right?
There's a difference between nominal protection. The nominal tariffs range from 56% to 113% for those consumer goods that we produce. But the effective protection is even higher. For instance, the biscuit industry is getting protection for 50 years of Bangladesh. And it's not an infant industry. Biscuits, we've been producing biscuits for centuries. So regardless of whether it's an infant industry, I can understand electronic industry is an infant industry. Those that produce air conditioners, refrigerators, this is an infant. They should get protection, but that should be time bound. You should tell them, how long do you want? Because at the end of the day, it's the consumer who's bearing this protection tax. He's the one who's paying higher prices for all these consumer products. Okay, he or she. So we are taxing the consumer to support the producer. This is a consumer producer, resource balancing story that comes out of trade, and that is what trade policy is about. You might be surprised what I'm saying. Wow. Trade policy basically tells you whether the incentive is for exports or for domestic sales.
Wow.
That is the binary choice. And trade policy is about that. Which trade policy do we have? Do we favor exports or do we favor domestic sales? And the fact of the matter is that our current trade policy favors this domestic sales to export. And that is why we have no traction. We're not having any traction in export diversification.
I see. Dr. Sattar, no one, yes. I don't believe anyone could have explained it so well. I learned so much today, and I'm sure our audience is going to learn tremendously from this. So just in a nutshell, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Sattar. So what you're saying is these tariff policies and stuff that we have, basically in the name of protecting local industries, what we are basically doing is, I would hate to use the word, but stiffing the consumer, so to speak. And consumers are paying the price for it. And also, would you say that also hinders competition? So it does not necessarily, in the long haul, is helping the local industry, because we are not innovating necessarily. We are not becoming more competitive, because in a healthy marketplace, you got to allow competition. Am I?
That's right.
Right, saying so?
Competition amongst the local producers, competition with imports, the two types of competition will improve productivity, quality. Obviously, if we have a situation where protection is ad infinitum, then logic tells us that they're not going to improve their product, and which will become internationally. India realized that after 50 years of independence. They realized that their goods were not competitive in the world market. They are producing everything.
Right. Oh my God. Dr. Sattar, just that point alone, I guess, is that piece of advice or that piece of knowledge is worth its weight in gold. I wish if we had more time. For today we unfortunately will have to wrap it up right here. Dr. Sattar, I thank you so very much for your precious time, and with an invitation, of course, with an invitation to have you join us many more times, because I would like to pick your brain on so many things, because you are the expert when it comes to trade policies, because you've spent your entire career in that arena. So
civil servant turned trade economist, you can say.
Right, very true, very true. Dr. Sattar, thank you again, and I would like to thank our audience for joining us today, and with an invitation to join us again next week. I sign off right here. Have a safe and stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.